Let's look at some study tips and strategies that are going to be helpful to approach this course or any course in general, really. You definitely want to start by studying the most difficult topics first. I encourage you to have a study schedule. I know this can be a new sort of learning curve to have to sort of balance multiple courses. So definitely have a schedule and think about studying the more difficult things that don't come naturally to you first. Try to preview material before class. This is really helpful. And it's going to help you to sort of just have more repetition, more passes at the material. So you don't have to master it, but definitely just scan through the slides. If there are any terms that look new to you, try to look those up and just have a layout of the topic or region that we're going to be discussing. That can be really helpful. Rewrite, summarize notes and things in your own words. So tables, diagrams, charts, the class outlines can be helpful for this. Definitely try to put your spin on these concepts or illustrations as another way to make sure that you're comfortable and you're able to master that. Okay, if you have a whiteboard accessible to you, that's another great way to do that. And you can, rewrite things so that you can determine your own gap in the understanding as you try to rewrite that. Study often by active recall. So try to recall, especially things you want to memorize or commit to memory, which are like factoids or facts. Definitely have them either on flashcards. Flashcards can be helpful for this, or just through repetitive practice. And do this at a spaced interval, right? So if you study this on Monday, maybe look at it again on Wednesday, look at it again over the weekend. And this is what we call spaced repetition, exposing yourself to this, trying to actively recall it at a spaced but continuous interval. Try to teach or explain concepts. This is where group study can be beneficial. And I know this is really hit or miss. Some people like to study alone. Some people like to study in groups. Some people like to study alone at first and then meet up with a group. So think about how your own learning style kind of fits into this. But studying with other people, trying to explain it to other people is another way to determine any gaps in your own understanding. And again, a whiteboard can be helpful with these types of study sessions. Multiple choice is the best way to practice. All the exams and quizzes will be in multiple choice format. So SI will have practice questions. During lecture, we'll have checkpoint discussion type questions. I will also have polling questions at regular intervals throughout lectures, and then weekly quizzes is another way to get practice. So um, definitely have a steady, continuous routine for practicing multiple questions. This is one of the best ways to make sure that you're prepared for the exams. And just a tidbit here, I like to take questions directly, almost verbatim, word for word from each of these areas. It just helps to incentivize paying attention when we do the polling, when we do the discussion, even going to SI. So I will take one or two questions, word for word from each of these formats, and so you can expect to see some of those on the exam. And then think about test taking strategies as well. If you're really bad with test or testing anxiety, I would definitely encourage you to be more intentional in this area. Read your questions carefully, slow down, practice mindfulness, maybe some breathing techniques. Definitely not second guess your answers. Switching your answers at the end can be one of those things that comes up from anxiety. So definitely be mindful in this area if you know it's something that you find challenging or have had history with, and then ask for clarification. I'm really a big proponent of asking for clarification. During our exams, I'll have a breakout room where you can get onto a one-on-one call with me. I can reword a question if you're not sure about the wording. You can ask for clarification on a word if you don't know the meaning. Definitely ask for help in terms of understanding questions. Just advocate for yourself in terms of getting clarification as needed. And this goes for a lecture as well. If I'm going at a fast pace, or you feel like I went over something very quickly, I can be a little bit fast, a fast talker sometimes. So definitely stop me, ask a question, ask me to go back. I welcome all those types of further clarification. All right. So these are just some things to bear in mind. I like to go over this now, early in the semester, so that you can approach the first two modules with this in mind. And then I'll do this again as just a reminder, refresher at the third module at about the mid-semester point. I'm going to pause here briefly for any questions. If not, we are going to keep moving along. Okay. All right, so our very first packet that we're going to get into is called a simplified body plan and homeostasis. This is really the underpinning of all that we will study throughout the 2 semesters of this course. Understanding how the body is designed and understanding how the body maintains a proper functioning or a state of health, which is homeostasis. So we're going to start out with that, and this will be the premise for all of the other topics and systems we discuss going forward. I'm going to start with a quick polling question here, just to set the tone. So, I'll usually give a minute and a half for these, longer if it has a lot of reading or more options, but usually a minute and a half, maybe a minute if it's like a really straightforward question. But let's go ahead for a minute and a half on this one. Great. So it looks like everyone's done. Let's see. And I will share the results. This is a great way to see how your response compared to the majority response and then ultimately to the correct response. So again, another way to just assess your own understanding. So the question is, what is the most abundant substance in the body? The majority of you went with B, and B is the correct answer. Okay. So out of proteins, fats and oil, collagen, water, water is the most abundant substance in the body. It's also the most abundant substance on the planet, for that matter. So it's a really important element. And we want to talk about how that is distributed throughout our body and how the movement of that water is important to a lot of internal body functions, right? Inside of our cells and within our tissues. So we're going to start discussing some of our fluid compartments. Our first lecture objective is to describe the distribution of water in the body and define the different body and fluid compartments. And then our second one is to get into homeostasis. So let's think about the organization of the body. Okay. And what we have here is what we call the minimalist body. So this is not an accurate representation of our body in terms of shape or size or proportions, but this is an interesting schematic because it shows us how our various body compartments are divided, right? By different membranes, for example, the lungs here, right? We have a barrier between the air we breathe in our internal environment. If we think about our gastrointestinal tract, there's a barrier between the lumen of that, where the food exists, versus the internal aspects of our bodies and cells. And then similarly with the urinary tract, right? There's a barrier between the urine that's been produced from the kidneys and the actual external environment as well. So this is how our body is divided, and we can already begin to see an external environment, which is the areas in purple, versus an internal environment, okay? So let's think about how that general distribution is existing. When we think about the internal environment, this is everything in the immediate environment of our cells. So we want to think about the tissue fluid, right, which is the fluid that is existing within and between our cells and tissues, as well as our plasma, the fluid that is existing within our blood vessels, right? We're going to call that plasma. So here's a blood vessel. And other than the cells that are existing in this blood vessel, there's also fluid there that we're going to refer to as plasma. So that's three general subcompartments that are existing in our internal body environment. The fluid that's around our cells, the fluid that is in our tissues, and the fluid that is around our blood cells inside the blood vessels, which is going to be our plasma. Now we can compare that to the external environment. This is everything that is outside of those three regions, outside of our tissues, outside of our cells, outside of our blood vessels. So this can still be inside the body. It's really important to understand that the external environment doesn't just mean outside of the body. The air that is inside of our lungs is considered external environment. The food that is inside of our gut is considered external environment, and the urine that's been produced in the bladder and the urinary tract is also the external environment, along with everything that is surrounding our external skin. So as long as it's not inside our cell, inside our tissue, or inside our blood vessel, it's still considered external environment, even though it's inside of our body, right? Really important. Let's think about the need for the barrier between these compartments. So between our external compartment, our plasma, our tissue fluid, and our cells, there are these barriers that prevent free exchange between these various areas. And the reason for that is the exchange of certain materials. So we want nutrients and oxygen to be able to get into these tissues, and we want waste products to be able to get out. So these various barriers, the barriers across the lungs, for example, between the air in the lungs and the tissues of the lung, the barrier across the GI tract between the lumen of the gut and the tissues of the gut, and the barrier between our urinary tract as well. So across these various barriers, we want to have exchange, not free-flowing movement, but intentional selectional exchange of nutrients and certain waste products. Let's think about what types of exchange occurs across these various barriers. So the first is the barrier between the blood and the external environment. So this is going to happen at the lungs, the GI tract, at the kidneys, right? These are the three areas that we can see some of these barriers. The skin is another barrier. The skin is much more selective, though, than some of these other barriers. Now, the mechanism for which exchange occurs across these barriers, for the GI tract, it's going to be absorption and secretion. And absorption is going to be the direction of movement. That's going to be movement of nutrients from the food that we've ingested into our bloodstream. That's how we absorb those nutrients, right? Proteins, via amino acids, fats, glucose, etc., can be absorbed from our gut lumen into our blood vessels. So that direction is called absorption. If we're moving substances in the opposite direction, that is called secretion. And the reason for this is to usually to secrete mucus, for example, in the GI tract. This is going to help to lubricate the content so that they can move through the tract easily. And so that direction of moving things from our cells or blood vessels out into the lumen, the opposite direction, this is referred to as secretion. Now, across the kidneys, we have three different types of mechanisms for movement. We've got filtration for one. Filtration is the process of taking the blood in our vessels and squeezing it across a filtration barrier. And that is pretty much how we create the filtrate that's called urine. So filtration is one process or movement. Reabsorption is another process of movement. As we create this urine, this filtrate, we can sometimes unintentionally filter substances and minerals that are needed by the body. So in order to reclaim those valuable substances, you want to move them back into the bloodstream, and that process is called reabsorption. This is movement in the opposite direction. All right. And then we can also fine tune that filtrate further by secreting substances that were not initially filtered. And that is going to be called secretion. So both filtration and secretion are moving a fluid and substances from our blood vessels into the urinary tract. And then reabsorption is movement in the opposite direction in order to reclaim those filtered substances. And I just want to point out the difference between absorption and reabsorption. Reabsorption implies that filtration occurred, and so we're just reclaiming those substances, whereas absorption implies, just moving those substances for the first time without any initial filtration. Okay. Now let's think about, having said that, we talk about internal compartment, external compartment, and the need for movement across those various barriers. Let's talk about how the fluid is divided across those various compartments. So first off, we want to think about how our compartments, our body is divided into several compartments. So some of these contain fluid, and they're separated by what we call epithelial membranes, which are the barriers that separate these various compartments. Now, these are going to be semi-permeable membranes, and semi-permeable implies that some things can get through, others cannot, especially if they're large, bulky particles. They cannot get through these membranes. If they're small particles, they can easily squeeze and get through these membranes. So we're going to have transport occurring between these various compartments. Let's think about what the entire water compartment is called first. This is called total body water. All the water that exists in your body that is dissolved in your cells, which is this portion here, in your blood vessels, which is this portion here, and then throughout your tissues, all of that together is called your total body water. Okay. Now this can be not just water, it's going to have certain solutes dissolved in this, like sodium, potassium, chloride, amino acids, glucose, that will be sort of dissolved to create the solution and not just pure water existing in the body. Now, within that total body water, we have smaller fluid compartments. So first is the ICF, the intracellular fluid compartment. And this implies all of the fluid that is inside your cells. This is usually referred to as the cytoplasm. When you talk about the intracellular organelles, we think about the mitochondria, we think about the ribosomes, the smooth SER, the smooth ER, the SER, etc. We think about the fluid in the cell, and that is the fluid that we refer to as ICF, or the cytosol, or the cytoplasm. Now, we also have the extracellular fluid, which is the larger compartment of all the fluid that is not inside your cells. It's in your body, but it's not within your cells. So this can further be divided into plasma. It's outside your cells, but it's inside your blood vessels, okay? So it's a subcompartment of the ECF that is inside the cells of your blood vessels. Now we have the second extracellular fluid compartment, which is the interstitial fluid. So again, it's outside of your cells, and it is the second subcompartment of the extracellular fluid, but it's the fluid that surrounds your tissues, okay? So here's the extracellular fluid compartment, and the two subcompartments are the plasma, which is inside your blood vessels, and then your interstitial fluid, which is surrounding your tissues. Okay, so I just want to repeat that again and go over that one more time. All the water is your total body water. That is divided into two major compartments: intracellular, which is inside your cells, extracellular, which is outside your cells, and then extracellular can be further divided into plasma, which is inside your blood vessels and surrounding your blood cells, and interstitial fluid, which is surrounding your tissues. Now, when we think about the distribution of that water, we can think about the relative proportions. So I don't want you to memorize these numbers, but it's important to think about the trend. Of all your total body water, most of that, about half of that, or over half of that rather, is going to be inside your cells, your intercellular fluid. Now, of your extracellular fluid, which is a much smaller proportion of that, the majority of that extracellular fluid is going to be in your interstitial fluid, okay? And the smallest proportion will be in your plasma. So the proportions, the numbers are not important, but think about how that's divided. Most of the fluid in your body is inside your cells, and of the proportion that is outside your cells, most of that smaller proportion is inside